My name is Duncan Epping. I'm a chief technologist working for VMware. Today I'll be talking about what's coming up for the near future of vSphere, but not just vSphere. So there's going to be some other things mentioned as well. Joe already mentioned some of these things in the keynote, so things like EVO Rail and EvoRail. Those are the types of things that I will also include in my session. So first of all, I want to briefly mention where I come from, just to give you an understanding what my history is. So I used to be a sysadmin, and I used to live in the physical world, so probably like a lot of you guys. This is what the typical data center looked like. So it was a big spaghetti mess of wires. You probably all recognize these types of rooms from 10, 15 years ago. After a while, we started consolidating applications on top of physical servers just to make sure that from an operational perspective, things were more efficient. Besides that, what we also had is when a new project was started, we had new servers rolling in. So although we started consolidating things, new servers were brought in all the time. It just made things complex in terms of management. Now, luckily for me, we moved over to a virtualized world, and this is actually a picture of one of the data centers I've been in, and one of the data centers I've helped building out. And they started out with, let's say, roughly 80 physical servers, and they consolidated to a smaller stack. So not just the consolidation was really useful for these guys when they started using virtualization, but it's more the standardization that was very useful for them and the new operational models that came with it. And as Joe, I think, mentioned in his keynote as well, it's all about getting around that cycle faster and faster, which means the time to market needs to be faster for your applications and for your business. I think that's a key thing. Now, in order to do that, I think one of the things that we started doing in the last couple of years is, increasing the efficiency when it comes to operating virtual machines, virtual workloads, applications, and hosts. So when it comes to operating virtual machines, in my opinion, it's all about consistency. And one of the few ways you can actually achieve consistency from an operational perspective is by automating things. Now, a lot of the feature sets and functionality that we have within our stack already allow you to do that, but there's some cool new pieces of technology coming out that will even improve this. So before we actually get started with what's coming up, I want to ask all of you, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I've got about 10 books, or I had 10 books. One person just nicked a book, which I guess only happens in Birmingham. So, if you have a question, best question, you will get a book. If you want a link to me on LinkedIn, feel free to connect to me. I'm also up on Twitter, and of course I've got a blog, so there's multiple articles on the topics that I'll be talking about, and they're probably more in depth than I'll be able to go into today. So there's a brief disclaimer. I'm not going to go into depth, but I just want to say that all of the features and functionality that I'll be discussing today will not necessarily be in the next version. Plus, it's also helpful for me so that I don't get into any trouble with our legal team when they hear about me presenting these types of features at a public event. So first of all, one of the things I wanted to discuss is efficiency. I already said, when it comes to efficiency, I think virtual machines are probably one of the most efficient ways to deploy applications these days. And at VMworld, we announced a new project, and this project is called Project Fargo. Now, Joe briefly touched on this during his keynote. And basically what he mentioned is that Project Fargo allows you to fork virtual machines. But what does that actually mean? If you look at a virtual machine today, and you want to deploy a new virtual machine, you take a VM template, or you take one of the virtual machines and you clone the virtual machine. Now, if you want to do that in a more efficient way, you can do a linked clone, which basically means you create a linked copy of the disk. So you point back to the old disk and create this differentiating disk, a delta disk. And new blocks will be written to that delta disk. But what about CPU and memory? Well, that's actually where Project Fargo, so VM4 comes into play. What Project Fargo allows you to do is it allows you to create this base virtual machine, and as they refer to it, a parent virtual machine. And you can fork that parent virtual machine into many, many child virtual machines. And those child virtual machines will be identical to the parent virtual machine. So you can imagine when you have a virtual desktop, which you normally would pre-provision. So if you have a virtual desktop environment, and you would pre-provision normally 400 or 500 desktops, let's say, with VM4, so Project Fargo, you no longer need to do that. Because you have this parent virtual machine, and it sits there in the QS state, so it's a pause state. It sits there doing nothing, just waiting to be forked. As soon as a user logs in, the VM fork mechanism will actually allow you to spin up a virtual machine in literally seconds. So if you look at VMfork, when it comes to VDI, for instance, we can provision virtual machines in less than 2 seconds. And the 2 seconds is long compared to some of the Linux distributions out there, for instance, because we can do Linux virtual machines much faster. The reason for the fact that it takes 2 seconds at this point in time is that for VDI, for instance, we also need to connect it to an Active Directory. We need to rename the virtual machine itself. We need to give it a unique ID. So there's some additional tasks that need to happen in the background. And that's the reason it slightly takes longer. Now, from a virtual machine perspective, as I said, you have the parent virtual machine, which is the top one. You have the child virtual machines, which is the bottom one. And it uses the same resources. So both from a disk perspective, it uses the same disk, same base disk, but it also uses the same memory blocks. So it uses the transparent page sharing mechanism to use the same memory blocks. But if a new block needs to be allocated, of course it can write new blocks as well, so both from a memory perspective, but also from a disk perspective. Now, as I've just mentioned, VDI is an excellent use case, but one of the other use cases that could be really useful for you guys in the near future as well is deploying virtual machines in the test dev environment. Especially you have a test dev environment where you have your own developers developing a specific application. And in a lot of the environments, at least a lot of the customers, we talk about, the pace is going up. Instead of releasing a new application every 4 months or every 3 months, they're releasing new applications every week. With VM Fargo, you'll be able at least to cater to their needs when it comes to deploying virtual machines in a really fast way. So some of the tests that we've conducted recently, it allowed us to spin up new virtual machines in 500 milliseconds. So just think about that. It's a split second. Before you know it, the virtual machine is there. The test team can conduct the tests, or the developer can conduct the tests, and they can stress the virtual machines as well. Now, the nice thing about this solution is because the virtual machines are really thin, when you delete them, you're also deleting a really thin thing. So from an impact perspective, both from resources on the compute and resources on the storage, it will be a bare minimum. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is simplicity. And the one thing that comes to mind when I talk about simplicity is virtual SAN. I've got a couple of books with me, so a good question about virtual SAN, raise your hand. Hopefully everyone knows what virtual SAN is about, but let me explain it in a couple of sentences. So virtual SAN is a distributed storage solution. It actually sits within the hypervisor, so it's a kernel module. It's not a virtual appliance, it's not something you install. It's something that you can enable in 2 clicks on a cluster level. So it's really, really easy to use. It's all about simplicity. Now what virtual SAN actually does is it uses local disks in your hosts, and it grabs those disks and it creates a shared data store out of it. So you have a bunch of hosts, could be anywhere between 3 and 32 at the moment. It grabs those local disks and serves those local disks up as a data store. It can use that data store for your virtual machine. Now, that's not the only key thing when it comes to simplicity. The other key thing when it comes to simplicity with virtual SAN is that it leverages the mechanism called policy-based management, and explicitly for storage, so storage policy-based management. So what that allows you to do is specify in a policy, for instance, what the resiliency of your virtual machine should be, or your virtual disk even, or what the performance should be like for your virtual machine or your virtual disk, which is truly unique. So you can specify all of these characteristics on a per virtual disk basis. And when you want to make changes to your virtual machine, you just change the policy, or you swap out the current policy for a new policy, and the policy will be applied to your virtual machine. Now, of course, there's new stuff coming up for virtual SAN as well. And one of the things that customers constantly were asking us, you have this virtual SAN environment, I need to have these spinning disks, but I don't want to use spinning disks because if you look at the consumer-grade flash drives, they're at the exact same price as a SAS drive today. So if you have a 10K RPM SAS drive, for instance, 1.2 terabyte drive, they're at the exact same price as a Micron consumer-grade flash device. So why not swap out my consumer-grade or my SAS drives for consumer-grade flash devices? Because I don't have any spinning media anymore, which means that chances of the disks breaking down actually become smaller. Well, with one of the upcoming versions of vSAN, you actually will be capable of doing so. So you can swap out your disks, put in these new flash devices, and start using these flash devices for reads. So the distinction here is, compared to the current model, we already use flash as a write buffer and a read cache. Within the new model, what we're aiming to do is use the enterprise-grade flash devices, which are already supposed to be in your virtual SAN environment anyway, use that for write buffering, so they incur all the writes, and then at some stage, destage all the reads or all the I/O to the consumer-grade flash devices and use the consumer-grade flash devices for reads, because that's what they are typically best at. The other thing that we're aiming to improve in one of the upcoming versions is snapshotting and cloning. So if you look at vSAN today, to be quite fair, when it comes to doing full clones, it performs kind of poor, and that it's due to the way that it actually handles the sequential writes and reads. Now, with the new version of vSAN, what we've done is we acquired a company about 2 years ago called Versto. And Versto had a cool solution, but it was based on the VSA. So you had an appliance installed, and it took all the reads and the writes, and it could sequentialize all the reads and the writes, and it could do some smart things with your I/O as well, but it could also do things like snapshotting and cloning. So what we did with the upcoming version of vSAN is we incorporated that logic into vSAN itself. So now you can use the Versto snapshot technology, which is a very high-efficient snapshot technology, but also high-performance snapshot technology, with your vSAN solution, and of course the cloning mechanism. So the other thing that pops up every once in a while when you start talking with customers about vSAN is, what about my blade environments? Because a lot of people invested in blade systems over the last 5 to 8 years. Can I use those with vSAN, for instance? And sure, you can use that even today. But the problem is with most of the blade systems, as you know, they typically only have 1 or 2 disk slots. Well, you need to have 1 disk slot for a PC or for a flash device already, so now you have only 1 disk slot left for capacity, which means that from a capacity standpoint, you're probably not hitting the requirements that you already have out there. So vSAN wasn't really useful in some of those blade environments. Now, with one of the upcoming versions, what we're aiming to do is support JBOD as well, so which means you can have an external disk system, connect that into your blade environment, and use that as a capacity tier, which is, in my opinion, something that's really cool. HP, for instance, has some of those systems. So they have those blade systems, and they have specific blade systems as well, which are called storage blades, and it can hold, let's say, 40 or 45 disks. And Dell and IBM are working on something similar. And of course, there's also the Open Compute platform, which offers things like that. And then last but not least, scale. I know some of our competitors have been talking about the fact that vSAN doesn't scale. Well, actually, from a vSAN perspective, there is no real scale limit. With the upcoming version, we're going to 64 nodes. And the reason vSAN will be limited to 64 nodes is the fact that HA and DRS are going to be limited to 64 nodes. From a vSAN standpoint, vSAN could scale up to 1,000 nodes if it wanted to. And that's just part of the architecture by default. But for now, for the next version, it's going to be 64 nodes. And to be honest, I don't know too many customers even doing 32 nodes at this point, so I think 64 nodes should cater at least for a year or two. If there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand.
You spoke about like reusing blades a lot of people have at the moment. If you put in a new system with using vSAN in a cluster of a number of machines, can you still add in your old workload just as compute power to vSAN?
Yeah, so the question is if you can add your old workloads, so your compute power, into a new vSAN environment. And if they are part of the same cluster, then technically you can actually move your hosts into the vSAN cluster and use that vSAN cluster in terms of storage. The question, though, is if you look at it from a failure domain perspective, and you look at things like isolation events, where one part of the cluster is isolated versus the other part of the cluster. If you don't have any disks, right, and HA needs to restart your virtual machine, it's going to be really difficult because it won't have access to those components. So from an architectural perspective, as an architect myself, I wouldn't recommend going that direction, but there are customers actually doing that. But it's kind of a challenging situation. Come up after the session to pick up a book, because you were the first one to ask a question. So if you look at vSAN, so how do we go about deploying a vSAN unit? So there are 3 ways. I'm pretty sure that Cormac has mentioned that in his session right now as well. First of all, you build based on the HCL components. Now, this is the most flexible option. You go to the HCL, you pick a server which is on the HCL, then you go to the vSAN HCL, and you pick a flash device, disk controller, and all of the other components, and you start building it. It's also the most complex one, because you need to make sure that all of those components not just from an HCL perspective are certified, but also some of the drivers work together, and the drivers are certified by the vendors as well, so the OEM vendor itself. Now, besides that, we also have an option called the vSAN Ready node. And the vSAN Ready node is something that has been created by the OEM, so they have a configuration itself which is specific to vSAN. It already contains pre-certified configurations, so it's fairly simple to deploy. The one challenge that you could have with it is that it doesn't really come pre-installed, and that's where the third option comes into play, EVO Rail. Now, I know Mike Levick is doing a full session on EVO Rail, but I think it clashes with this one as well, so I'm going to go briefly over what EVO Rail is, so all of you are aware of it. But EVO Rail basically is a 2U, 4-node solution. So it's a compute solution which also contains storage. And the cool thing about EVO Rail is that it comes pre-installed with vSphere, virtual SAN, login site, and the EVO Rail engine itself. Now, because of the fact that it comes pre-installed, it means that you power it on within your data center, you cable it, and then you configure it. And you literally can configure this within 15 minutes. Today, it actually scales up to 16 nodes, but it will go up further than that.
Just a quick question, just jumping back to the HCL. I know there have been a couple of articles on the register about HCL-certified hardware that's then been dropped.
Yeah.
Is there any concern that a customer might buy into this and buy some hardware that's on the HCL and then
Okay.
time?
Yeah, so the question is, some of the HCL hardware has been dropped not too long ago, actually. What about our customers? What happens to them? It's a good question, it's a valid question, and we actually, as VMware, took care of that. So we realized one of the disk controllers that was on the HCL, for some of the vendors, that disk controller had a queue depth of 600. For other vendors, it had a queue depth of 25. Now, you can imagine when you start doing a lot of I/O, and you need to drive I/O down to a disk, and it only has a queue depth of 25, that's going to take a really, really, really long time, and that was actually the case in this scenario. So what we did is we removed that controller from the HCL, and we offered those customers that had that disk controller an alternative. So we actually bought new disk controllers for those customers. So they were definitely taken care of. So, and it's a statement that VMware made as well internally. If anything happens in this scenario, we'll make sure that the customers are taken care of. So we just don't leave you sitting there without a system. We'll make sure that those parts will be replaced. Now, if you look at EVO Rail, this is also a pre-configured box by itself. So it will come with a disk controller flash, and that's all statically configured. So you can't make changes to the configuration itself. Now, that's part of the user experience, as I would call it, because it also means that when you want to procure one of these systems, you'll have a single SKU. So you go to Dell or HP, whomever is your vendor, you tell them you want to have an EVO Rail box, and that's what's going to be shipped. So not just from a procurement perspective, but also from a support perspective. So you have a single point of contact for support. So you won't be phoning up VMware for support. You'll be phoning up HP or Dell or Fujitsu or whatever it is, and they'll take care of it, whether it's the hardware part, the software part, any of the drivers, whatever is included in the package. Now, what I wanted to show is what it actually takes to configure these, because I think that's something that's truly unique. And I was part of this project, and as Joe said, it was all about getting something up and running within 15 minutes and be able to deploy virtual machines on top of that. But what do you have to do to get it up and running? Well, there's a couple of things. You will need to specify a name. But specifying names for all of your ESXi hosts, if you don't know how many you will have, it's going to be a tedious task. So what we did is we created this solution where you can fill out a naming scheme. So for ESXi host, you fill out a naming scheme. Any host that gets added will use that naming scheme and will use the next number that's free. Same applies to IP, for instance. We don't specify we don't specify individual IP addresses. We specify the IP range. So any new block that gets powered on will get an IP address from that range and so forth and so on. Now, besides that, if you install a vSphere environment and you install LogInsight and install vCenter, and you want to do something like time synchronization, you actually need to configure that on about 5 or 6 different places. So we took care of that in the configuration UI as well. So you mentioned the NTP server once, EVO Rail will take care of that. So we'll configure NTP for you. But for also something like syslogging. If you want to do syslogging today, there's 3 or 4 configuration files that we need to go through. EVO Rail will take care of that. And it's even The cool thing about it is if you don't have a syslog server and you want to use syslogin, you can even specify that you want to use loginsight, and it will deploy loginsight for you, it will configure loginsight for you, and it will be there for you to consume. Now, after you're done, it will start configuring it, and after about 15 minutes, it's done. And then you can start using it. But we just don't point you to the web client. What we will actually do is we will point you to our own interface. You can still use the web client. If you prefer to use the web client, you like all the 1,000 options you have to your disposal, you can still use that web client, but you don't need to. There's an alternative out there, and I think the alternative is really cool, because the alternative is focused on managing virtual machines, creating a virtual machine, destroying a virtual machine, doing some tiny things around the management interface itself, so monitoring how many IOPS am I doing, from a resource consumption, what do things look like, a really simplistic interface. So it's a truly unique interface in my opinion, and the coolest part probably is that it's not based on the standard web client technology. I'm not going to bash it, but this is based on HTML5. So you can run it on any device. We don't care. So now that we've spoken about EVO Rail, what about its bigger brother?
Do you sort of consider the EVO Rail stuff to be for new customers as opposed to...
Yeah, so the question is if the EVO Rail stuff is for new customers or for existing customers. And to be honest, the units that we sold so far all been going to existing customers, and they're typically for dedicated projects. Things like VDI, specific new projects that are going out there for test dev, environments, those are the typical scenarios. But some of the larger deals that we're talking about today are primarily in the robo space.
I mean, does it integrate in any way if you have like an existing virtual center?
Yeah, so
vShield and things like that, it's not designed to sort of sit in.
yeah, so from a question is around integration, and from an integration perspective, I think that's currently where the story is still a bit weak, if I'm being completely honest and blunt. That's something that's being looked at for the future, so it's definitely something that they will be attacking for the next version to make sure we can actually integrate with what's coming out. So that's something that we'll be solving in the upcoming version. Yeah, so the high-end graphics stuff, when it comes to GPUs, yeah, it's a good question. So the high-end GPU stuff is currently not included. So it's something that's being looked at as well. What we did is we came to market with something that we felt could at least accommodate 80–85% of our customers today. Some of those things will be introduced in the next version. The hardware partners are already looking at expanding that.
Duncan, with the EVO Rail, this year I buy a Dell, next year company policy changes and I buy an EMC box. Who do I go to then for support? Because if they're both operating...
Yeah, so the question is around support. If I change vendors halfway down, who do I go to? Well, it's fairly simple. For the system that you bought from Dell, you will go to Dell. For the system that you bought from EMC or any other vendor, you will go to the other vendor. So it's
If they're operating as a team?
yeah, so if they're part of the same cluster, then you need to ask yourself from an operational standpoint if that's something you want to do, because the configuration is probably going to be different. And when it comes to managing clusters with different type of resources, there's got to be, from an architectural perspective, it's going to be challenging. So that's something that's being looked at right now, because I asked the same question myself. It's a question that comes up naturally. But to be honest, I haven't met too many customers actually mixing different brands within the same compute cluster. Now, if you look at the bigger brother, and Joe already mentioned it, EvoRail, as the name already states, it's a rack-based solution. It's kind of similar to EvoRail when it comes to simplicity. It's all about getting an SDDC up running in a minimum amount of time. I don't know if anyone has tried to install VCAC. A couple of hands. Well, you probably know that it takes not a couple of hours, probably not even a couple of days, potentially even a week, or depending on what you're going to include. It's fairly complex to set up. With EvoRail, all of that is actually included within the box. So it comes pre-configured from the OEM as well. It will have things like VCAC included, and that will be installed for you. Now, it doesn't only have VCAC included. If you look at the comparison between EvoRail and EvoRail, you will also see, for instance, that it has NSX included, which is something that's really cool. When it comes to NSX, what we'll be using it for, of course, is things like creating a layer 3 fabric across multiple racks, because it will be leveraging a leaf-spine network configuration. On top of that, when it comes to configuring this, there's, of course, multiple components of the vCloud suite that will be included. If you look at things like VCOps, for instance, those will be part of EvoRail, but EvoRail or VCOps will also be customized for EvoRail itself. So you will see some lower granular level hardware details within the EvoRail as well. So that, again, is all about user experience. It's about simplifying the deployment of the infrastructure itself that you need to run your applications on, because that's the most important part, the applications. Now that we spoke about vSAN and some of the components or the new features or products that are coming out that will leverage vSAN, what about my old world? So if you live in the old world today and you need to deploy a virtual machine, you probably need to talk to your storage administrator and need to figure out where you need to land that virtual machine. If you're lucky, you have something like an Excel spreadsheet. If not, you need to go into the back end of the array, try to figure out where it needs to land based on some of the characteristics that you need. So it's quite difficult to manage. So what we're working on, and this is something that's coming out in the near future, and I actually just sat in a session by Nimble, and they presented on virtual volumes as well, is this functionality that allows you to change the way you operate storage. So what virtual volume for you actually does as a virtualization administrator, it allows you to focus on the virtual machine and the virtual disk. And from a virtual disk perspective or a virtual machine perspective, what you can do is you can tie a policy to a virtual machine. So instead of landing a virtual machine on top of a data store that may be replicated or may not be replicated, what we'll actually do with virtual volumes is you tie a policy to that virtual machine, and that virtual machine gets deployed, and on the back end in the array itself, it will do its magic. Now, the good advantage for the storage administrator by itself, or for the storage administrator, is that he gets to focus on what he likes to be focusing on. So that's the capacity, basically a container, and some of the capabilities that he'll be servicing up to vCenter. So if you look at what it looks like from an architectural perspective, and the funny thing is that this diagram looks a lot more complex than the previous diagram, but the only reason it looks more complex than the previous diagram is because it's been designed to make your life simpler. Not our life simpler, but your life simpler. So what we actually do is we have this storage policy-based management layer, which is the layer at the top. And that layer actually presents different capabilities to you as the vSphere admin. So that could be anything ranging from replication, deduplication, snapshotting, for instance. You create policies that contain those capabilities, and you assign those policies to virtual machines. As soon as you assign a policy to a virtual machine, then the array will take an action. So it will place that virtual machine or that virtual disk in a container that contains their capabilities, and it will take action based on those capabilities provided. So from an operational perspective, I think this is going to change your life. Now, the one thing to keep in mind here, though, is because everyone is excited about it from a storage point of view. A lot of the storage vendors are happy about, virtual volumes being released. And why they're being happy? You need to have a certain level of array in order to support this. So what if you have an array that actually doesn't support virtual volumes and isn't going to support virtual volumes in the near future? Well, for those who don't have array that support virtual volumes, there's something coming out called I/O filters. And what I/O filters basically is, it's a filter that sits in the hypervisor itself, and it catches all of the I/O. So within that layer, then you're capable of doing smart things with the I/O. So you can imagine you do things like caching, or you do things like replication. I think one of the best examples of the last couple of years is probably Pernix Data. They've done a really great job when it comes to caching. So flash caching, I/O acceleration, as they like to call it. So this is something that is going to be introduced to the larger ecosystem as well. So more vendors will be capable of doing something similar as Pernix Data has been doing for the last 2 years. So the two key use cases will be caching. The one vendor that's currently working on that is SanDisk, formerly known as FlashSoft. The other key use case is replication. So you can imagine something like EMC recover point, for instance. Instead of having it run within an appliance, you can stick it straight into the hypervisor itself and replicate your virtual machines from a hypervisor perspective. So not on the storage array, but from a hypervisor perspective. So if you have a lower-end array that doesn't support the type of replication mechanisms that you require, now you can actually stick it into the hypervisor and start using that instead. So next up, availability. So when I talk about availability, I don't necessarily talk about vSphere HA. There's more to availability if you ask me. So things like resource management, for instance. DRS is also an availability tool because it allows you to provide resources to your virtual machine, so the availability of resources. So what's coming up on one of the next versions is something called IOPS reservations. So if you look at the current version of vSphere, there's already a scheduler in there called mclock, which allows you to set some form of reservations, but it wasn't really exposed in the UI. So with the next version, we'll be exposing that capability in the UI, which means that if you have a virtual machine and for whatever reason, it always requires 5,000 IOPS, you can now specify that in the UI, and the system will actually take that into account. So both when it comes to scheduling, but also, for instance, when it comes to storage TRS. I don't know if too many people are using storage TRS, but if you would be using storage TRS, then storage TRS can actually move your virtual machines around based on the requirements that you specified from an IOPS standpoint, which is really cool. Now, Frank and I have worked for a long time on storage TRS, and a lot of people said storage TRS is really cool, but I have a thin environment, or my environment is thin provision, or I have deduplication. If it moves my virtual machine from data store A to data store B, sometimes the result could be negative. So it moves it around, and I have less space available after the move simply because it isn't aware of the deduplication domains. Now, with the next version of storage TRS, what we'll introduce as well is the awareness of the functionality of the array. So we will be aware of the fact that the array is deduplicating your blocks. And we will be aware of the fact that your array is, for instance, replicating virtual machines. So if you form the data store cluster out of different consistency groups, for instance, when we move virtual machines around, we'll make sure that we move the virtual machine around to a data store that's part of the same consistency group that it already belonged to. You can imagine from an application perspective, that's really, really important, because you don't want to have your virtual machine moving around to a different consistency group, and then when you recover the virtual machine, find out that you can't really recover it in the way you expected it to recover because your application server is at a different level than your database. And that actually happens in real life. So I think that's really cool when it comes to storage and availability. But what about HA itself then? Is anything new coming up for HA? Well, of course, we've got new stuff coming up. 2 years ago, we already spoke about something called component protection. And that's what this new feature is all about. Just a question, has anyone ever encountered an all patch down scenario where your storage just was gone? I see a lot of people. So today, if you encounter an all patch down scenario, just virtual machines just sit there and do nothing. They just wait. If you're lucky, then at some time the Microsoft OS or the Linux OS just bombs out, and HA potentially restarts it, potentially. With the new version, we actually have logic built in that will allow HA to respond to an APD. On top of that, you can also configure it to respond to a PDL, which you can also do today, but in a much smarter fashion. Now, the other thing, which I think has been a problem for the longest time, is admission control. So about, I think it was 3 years ago, I was flying over to San Francisco, and I was looking at Frank. I'm like, admission control really sucks. Because when I look at admission control, I need to specify reservations. Why would I want to specify a reservation? I want to make sure that my virtual machines, when they get restarted, get the same amount of resources after the restart as they had before the restart, for whatever. I mean, depending on the type of failure that occurs, of course. So we were having a discussion with the engineering team, and they said, hey, you know what, that's actually pretty smart for a Dutch person. So let's see what we can do around that. And they actually started working on something. So what they created is something called the Resource and Availability Service. So what that allows you to do is it allows you to import some of the DRS details. So you drag a DRS dump into the REST service itself, and then you simulate a failure. Now, after you simulate the failure, it will actually tell you how many virtual machines can be restarted. So in this case, it will say, all the virtual machines can be restarted, and after the restart, they will have the same amount of resources available. So that's really cool. Now you know that when a host fails, you have a good result. But you can also do other things like, I want to specify which hosts have failed. So in this scenario, multiple hosts have failed. And you can see that although all virtual machines will be restarted, 16 of those virtual machines will have a lower number of resources assigned. So there could be memory, there could be CPU, than before the restart. So this is going to impact the SLA that you potentially have with your business owners. And that's one of the reasons we started developing this feature set. Now, besides specifying, of course, how many virtual machines will be restarted, there could also be a scenario where, for instance, virtual machines can't be restarted. So that means you need to start buying new resources. So that's something that's coming out in the near future as well. So we just spoke about HA. What about FT? I think for the last 4 editions of VMworld, we spoke about MultiVCPU FT. And now it's actually coming. Well, I'm not promising it for the next version, but it's coming at some point in the near future, next year or the year after that. So what's cool about VSMP FT, a lot of people don't understand why it took us this long to release it, and the reason is simple. When you need to make sure that virtual machines are in sync from a CPU perspective, and you have, for instance, 4 CPUs, you need a lot of bandwidth. So what they ended up doing is they had to rewrite the whole SMP protocol itself. So we used to have this thing called VLockstep, and they had to rewrite the whole VLockstep. So they came up with a VSMP FT protocol, which is a bit more efficient, but it's not really the same. The other thing that they had to do to make sure that you can actually do SMP FT is we're no longer using shared vMUG. So that means if you're enabling FT in the future, you need to have that space available on your array for that secondary virtual machine, because it will need to spin out a new disk. So take that into consideration when you start doing your designs for the next version.
Do you use VLockstep for single FTs, or is it completely gone?
Yeah, so the question is if VLockstep is completely gone. It's actually it's completely gone, so it's been completely replaced. And of course, the networking part. You won't be able to transmit these many packets in a reasonable amount of time on a 1 gig network. So you need to have a 10 gig network if you want to use vSMP FT. So we spoke about availability, but what about mobility? One of the challenges, for instance, with vMotion is that there's this boundary, and this boundary is the virtual data center. And you also have the vCenter server as the boundary itself. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to tackle this problem, and we wanted to allow you to actually move virtual machines between vCenter instances. So with the next version, you can actually do that. So you can move a virtual machine from vCenter instance A to vCenter instance B. They could even be in different data centers, as long as they share the L2 network from a vMotion perspective, and as long as they are part of the same SSO domain. So if you want to do something like this, make sure that all of your vCenter servers are part of the same SSO domain. You have a single web client to manage those, and you can actually move them from left to right, which is something that's truly unique. Now, besides moving them between VCs, you can also do things like moving a virtual machine between different distributed switches. It's not something that you encounter too often, but it could be handy when you're doing, for instance, a migration between different vCenter servers or things like that. Now, besides going between VCs, of course, there's also the aspects of going across sites, as I've already mentioned, but what about the distance? So in the past, we had a limit of 10 millisecond latency. Now, for the majority of the people in the US, 10 milliseconds is nothing. They couldn't really move their workloads around. For most of us, it's probably okay. But if you look at the next version, what they are targeting is 100 milliseconds. This basically means that you can move a workload from the East Coast to the West Coast, or from England to Spain if you wanted to. What they also did is, from a long-distance vMotion perspective, is they are targeting to have an integration with virtual volumes. So as I said, virtual volumes is this per VM, per vMDK granular level solution. And now, with long-distance vMotion, you can move stuff around from A to B. But what if you're replicating your storage, right? So you're replicating your storage from A to B, and I move my workload from A to B, and now sits in B, but my replication direction is still from A to B. Well, with the new vMotion technology, it will actually revert the replication as well. So we'll revert the replication. Replication will now be from B to A, and you're good to go. So for data center migrations or disaster avoidance, that could be a really cool solution. So what about scalability? Because I'm a big fan of the vCenter Linux appliance. I love the appliance itself. It's really simple to manage. It's simple to install and configure. But it wasn't really up to par compared to the Windows version. Now with the next version, what we're doing is removing those constraints that we had with the the Linux appliance. So if you look at these numbers up there, 1,000 hosts per VC. I don't know if there are any customers over here doing 1,000 hosts. I haven't met too many of them, but you can actually do that if you want to. 64 hosts per cluster. So as I said, for vSAN, the numbers are going to go up. That implies that for HA and DRS, the numbers are going to go up as well. And you can run a massive amount of virtual machines as well per cluster. Not too many people do this because I still consider a cluster to be a failure domain. I'd rather have multiple failure domains than one big failure domain, but if you want to, you can actually start doing that. Now, of course, when it comes to link mode, you can have multiple VCs and you can connect these VCs if you wanted to. Hold on. Yeah. So the question if there's going to be a method to migrate the configuration from Windows to the appliance, and it's something that they've been working on for a couple of years now. It's actually a concept that someone pitched in the Fling ID contest that was out there, and they've been working on it. I haven't seen it yet, but I can ask around, and as soon as I find out, I will let you know. I'll blog about it. Yeah, so from a third-party integration perspective, all plugins should be supported as normal, both for the VCVA and the Windows version. I think from a VMware perspective, we've been really clear towards all of our partners that the VCVA is the way forward. They're all focusing on the web client, so there were a couple of stubborn vendors that just kept them only supporting the C# client, and even internally we had those problems, right? Some of the teams said, yeah, not too many people are using the web client, so I'll just do the C# client, which is not the way to go, because it means that you as a customer, you just need to use those two different tools. So everything is moving over to the web client. B, the primary focus will be the VCVA, if you ask me. You had another question, Dave?
Yeah, so could you use the multi-FT with the virtual appliance?
Yeah. So the question is if you can use multi-FT for the VCVA or for Windows, and yes, so with the next version, in terms of protecting VC against failures, you can use FT. Currently, you can't do that because I think the smallest VCVA starts out with 2 vCPUs. With the next version, you can actually use FT to protect your VC virtual machine, which is pretty cool, which is useful as well because Heartbeat has been deprecated, as most of you know.
Will there be SQL Server support for the appliance in the upcoming release?
So external database. So the question is around SQL support for the appliance, and yes, external databases will be supported. So what about usability? Because I know not everyone was too happy with the web client. Well, we're also introducing a bunch of changes with the web client, and I was one of the people responsible for causing what I would call a shitstorm internally about the web client. Oh, it's recorded. Oh well. Anyway, so what I did is I gathered a lot of your feedback. There was a big thread on the community forums, and I want to thank all of you for it. So I gathered all of the feedback, and I placed it in a Socialcast post, which is quite notorious at this point because it has 1 billion updates. And it basically stated what you guys felt about the web client. And what I did is I literally took your words. So if someone said, it's a turd, it's a polished turd, that's what I copied into the post. And that actually triggered some responses. So I had a lot of discussions with the web client team, and what they started doing is they started making changes to the web client itself. So for instance, if you look at the C# client, you have that task pane at the bottom, which everyone likes. That's something that's going to be introduced in the next version of the web client. The other thing is if you look at the C# client, when you use a menu, the menu structure is quite flat. You don't have the multiple levels. You don't have the hierarchies. We're introducing that into the next web client as well, just to make it easier, simpler, just to make sure that you can reach everything within a couple of clicks, which I think is really cool. The other thing that they did is they started looking at performance. So we have a performance team that only does, well, it's a full daytime job to do analysis of things like storage solutions and you name it. But now they started focusing on the web client. They just wanted to see what the difference was in terms of response time. So they spent a lot of time working with the web client and analyzing, some of the issues that were out there, and they improved the performance as well. One of the things to keep in mind when it comes to management, I know some of the customers are using linked mode. There's going to be convergence when it comes to link mode and SSO. So there's going to be some changes introduced. Link mode more or less is going to disappear, and it will be more an SSO-based solution. So you will see that change over the course of time as well. And as I said, there are some performance improvements that will be introduced in the next version, which I think are highly welcome. So then the last part of the presentation is the content library. So the question is if there are any plans to move away from Flash. Well, you saw the EVO Rail interface, and EVO Rail interface was based on HTML5. A lot of the new developments when it comes to the newer UIs are based on HTML5. So there are definitely plans to move out, but as you can imagine, in terms of investment, in terms of testing, backwards compatibility, partners already buying into the web client story and now having built their solution that way, it's not something that you can rip and replace easily, especially you look at the time it takes to develop something like that. But the new way forward is definitely HTML5, and it's something that's going to be introduced. I don't expect it to be introduced in the upcoming year, but it's something that will happen fairly soon, reasonably soon, in terms of VMware terms. So the content library. The funny thing is that this is something that the idea, the concept has been around for a long time. I still recall we had, I thought it was vSphere 4 in the beta, we had something called a content library. You could actually store your templates in a central location, and all of a sudden it disappeared, and now it's back. So with one of the upcoming versions, we'll have something called a content library, which allows you to store your templates, your ISOs, your scripts in a single library, and you can replicate that library as well to multiple locations. So if you have multiple VCs or you have multiple locations, you can actually replicate that library, and the same object, so the same template, will be available in all of the different sites. So you create this template, you update this template, and it will be automatically distributed to the various sites, which I think is truly unique. But especially when it comes to scripting. So what I've seen in a lot of the environments, they start creating these scripts. They have a script for configuring something or doing audits, and now they deploy 50 new hosts. They add these scripts to these different hosts, so now they have 15 versions of those scripts. And when you need to maintain those scripts, it gets kind of challenging. If you're lucky, they're smart and they use an NFS share, and they have these in a central repository. In most cases, they don't. So now they have different scripts. The results are going to be different, which also means that your environment will be different. Content library will prevent that from happening. So I think this is a cool piece of functionality that's coming out in the near future. And I think that's the last slide. So I want to thank all of you for attending my session. If there are any questions, raise your hand and let's see if I can answer them.
With regards to the snapshot functionality you mentioned earlier, is it going to be copy on write or redirect?
Sorry? Yeah, so the question is around the snapshot functionality, if it's copy-on-write-based or not, or redirect. So it's a redirect-based solution. So it's not a copy-on-write-based solution. It's more efficient than the current mechanism. That's the reason we're replacing the current mechanism as well. As you look at the snapshot mechanism that we have today, it's not the best snapshot mechanism in the world. I would argue that it's quite poor, to be honest. But it is what it is. It's something that was invented 10, 12 years ago, and back then when we had 20 virtual machines running in an environment, it functioned fine, but today it's not the best solution. You can pick a book by there, pick up a book.
Do you think, say for instance, in the coming months, if I bought an EvoRail kit and I've got currently 2 data centers, do you reckon coming forward I could deploy EvoRail in a 4 data center, then reutilize my other 2 data centers in like a one-to-many replication?
So in terms of replication or in terms of using EvoRail?
Well, in terms of replication, so my EvoRail is my main data center day-to-day, but as you said, long-distance replication, I put one in Europe, one in the UK, replicate.
Yeah, so the question is around replication with EVO Rail. Now, if you look at EVO Rail itself, it comes with the full VMware stack pre-installed. It includes Enterprise Plus. It will include things like Log Insight. So you can also use things like vSphere replication. But the problem with vSphere replication is the RPO and the RTO today. So it's 15 minutes. But if you look at, for instance, EMC has already announced that they will also be selling a solution, an EVO Rail-based solution, which will include Recover Point. Now, with Recover Point, you could do something like synchronous replication. So potentially, if you have multiple sites and you want to do EVO Rail, you could do that. One caveat, though, with the current version of EVO Rail, if you look at the UI is based on the cluster itself. So if you have multiple clusters, So you have a cluster inside A and a cluster inside B, will have 2 management instances. But that's something that's definitely being looked at, because from a product standpoint, one of the big use cases is definitely robo deployments or multi-site deployments when it comes to EVORail. So it's something that we'll be focusing on for sure.
With regards to the long distance vMotion, is that going to be over layer 3?
So the question is with regards to long distance vMotion, if that will be over layer 2 or over layer 3. As it stands in the current version, as you know, vMotion only supports layer 2, unless you actually dial up VMware support. And vMotion over layer 3, you can actually get what they call an RPQ for that, which means you get a one-off support for vMotion over layer 3 in the current version. So you can imagine in the upcoming version, vMotion over layer 3 will definitely be supported. So you can just move your virtual machines around. You don't need to have that layer 2 domain going across sites if you don't want to, which I know most of the networking people are not too happy about when you have that conversation. So that's definitely something that's going to be supported in the upcoming versions. And it's not tied to NSX or any of that. So it's independent of the infrastructure you have running.
Will there be a 64-bit plugin for the web client?
If there will be a 64-bit plugin.
Yeah, the web client. You know, at the moment when you first point the browser,
Yeah.
you have to download.
A good question. I actually don't know. I can ask. If you reach out to me on my blog or through Twitter or LinkedIn, then I will ask for you what the answer is to that one. I ran into the same problem. I had some challenges around that as well. I haven't seen it solved in the current version that's out there, so I actually don't know the answer to that, to be honest. In the back.
Is there any automated method for backing up the embedded Postgres database in VCSA?
Yeah, so if there's an automated method to back up the database of the VC or the VCVA. Yeah, so as it stands today, I haven't seen an automated mechanism to do a backup of that solution. Now, of course, you can back up the virtual machine itself, but I haven't seen the capability of backing up the database. And it is actually something that we've asked for as well. Now, to keep in mind is that from a VMware standpoint, is what they did in the past is if you look at VC, there were still some files stored locally, so not everything was stored within the database. And it was mainly around DRS, so DRS had some local files that it was using. All of that now is contained within the database, and if it's self-contained within the VCVA itself, you should be able to rip and replace that VCVA within using the standard tools. So a database backup and recovery shouldn't be needed, but if you have any specific use cases, feel free to reach out to me and I can provide them back to the engineering team. Or if you sit down with Joe at some point in time, he is also more than happy to do that. I think I've got time for 2 more questions. One here and then.
It's not something you talked about today, but I wonder if there's any improvements to VMware tools coming at all, in so much as we've got like 800 machines in our estate, and we've had a few bugs and stuff with VMware tools in recent months. We've had to try to schedule them all in to get updated.
Yeah, so
or you can't hamstring by the fact that's just the way the Windows works and reboots.
yeah, so the question is around VMware tools. If there are going to be any improvements. So I would say that with 5.5, we already improved VMware tools. And in terms of reboots, we removed a lot of those requirements. But as you know, I mean, we're still depending on an OS like Windows to not force us to reboot the operating system. Because if you look at it from our perspective, we don't need to reboot the OS. We don't really care if the OS is rebooted. We just restart the service. Why would I want to reboot the OS? If I have a new device, it should just see the device and just use it. But unfortunately, not all operating systems are created equally, which means that in some cases, you will need to do 1, 2, or 3, or maybe even more reboots. But it's definitely something that the team is looking into heavily, and especially when it comes to, for instance, the just-in-time solutions, so VMfork and VMFargo that I mentioned. If you look at those types of solutions, we try to remove the requirements to reboot a virtual machine because that's going to lengthen the provisioning process. And as I said, we're capable of doing that in 2 seconds, so some of those problems will be solved in the near future for sure. So the last question?
Yeah, the PC or PCA that you've done with the EVO Rail and the EVO Rail, will it be able to automatically protect itself with the SAP fault tolerance?
Yeah, so the question is if the the vCVA that's included with EvoRail and EvoRail will be able to automatically protect itself with vSMP FT in the future. And I think that's a great feature request. So I will submit it to the team and make sure they actually make it part of it. So it's a discussion that we had internally as well. What happens to an EvoRail box if the vCVA dies, because now your management plane is gone? We didn't really have a great answer to it. We tried various things. You know, we've hacked around with it. William Lamb did a couple of scripts. It was just too complicated to manage for most people, so we decided not to go that route because we knew vSMP FT is coming out. I'm pretty sure that it's on the radar of the team, but I'll make sure that I'll submit a feature request and they'll get it in one of the next versions. So with that, I would like to thank you all, and hopefully you'll have a great day. And if you have any other questions, feel free to stop by. The people that I pointed out, stop by to grab a book. Thanks.